My Rights, My Safety, a workshop series on people with disabilities and the law. Workshop number 3, Criminal Law Amendment Act, 11th June 2021. Advocate Shikha Silliman Bhattacharjee, lawyer and researcher.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Srinidhi and I work as the co-leads program at Rising Flame. A warm welcome to all of you on this Friday evening for our last part of the three-part series in English of My Rights, My Safety. This session will be taken by Shikha Silliman Bhattacharjee and we will be focusing on the criminal law amendment. Shikha is a writer, a researcher, and a lawyer, and she is one of the co-authors of the Human Rights Watch report, which was released in 2018, which focused on violence against women with disabilities in the context of the criminal law amendment. We're so happy to have you here, Shikha. The idea behind this series was for people with disabilities, organizations, civil society members, lawyers, and social workers to have access to the information around the law, but in an attempt to safeguard the rights of women with disabilities. The past 2 days, we covered two laws. On the first day, we spoke about prevention of sexual offenses against children. And yesterday, we did the domestic violence legislation, where we spoke in detail about what provisions are available for women to access. Today, we have Shikha, who will be taking us through the criminal law amendment. What are the possibilities in this law, and what does it say with regards to women with disabilities? Thank you so much, Shikha, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to this session and discussing these issues with the group. I think just one other thing that I'd like to add is that the co-author of the report in this book, Violence, who is the director of Rising Flame. So I just wanted to mention that Nithi worked with me on that. So a little bit about what I would like to do as far as an approach today. I am going to stay away from particular citations to particular articles of the amendments and those sort of things, for the reason that those things are hard to remember and it's better to have them written down anyway. And so what I'd like to send you instead as a reference document where you can find detailed information on any of the things that we discuss are a set of links, and I'll just tell you what they are. So the Human Rights Watch report, Invisible Victims of Sexual Violence, Access to Justice for Women and Girls with Disabilities, as Srinidhi said, was really looking 5 years after the 2013 amendments. Were they being implemented? What were the barriers and what were the challenges? So there's an easy to read version in English, an easy to read version in Hindi, the full report in English, and the full report in English is actually where you will find the legal citations to all relevant case law, in addition to citations to the law and the act itself, as well as discussions of how POCSO fits in when you think about the rights of girls with disabilities, children with disabilities. So I'll leave those with you, and I'm happy to talk about detailed provisions of the law if that's what's interesting in the Q&A. But I really wanted to use our time together to discuss a bit about what is the process of seeking relief and how can we prepare for it in the incidents that one of us faces violence, or how can we support people who face violence in our families, in our communities, in our networks, who we work with through our organizations. So the roadmap of where we'll go is I'll start with taking you through what rights do women have with disabilities under the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013, and we'll discuss that in stages. So as each stage of moving through the justice system, what are your rights and what do you need to do to access them? And then I will, out of that longer discussion, do a quick 5-minute recap of key points. If these are the only things you remember and take away, please take these away. And then I'll open up our discussion with some of the things we documented in the report in terms of what are the risk factors for violence, as well as the barriers to accessing justice, and how do those interact with the legal framework that we've just discussed. So I'll let you know where we are in the presentation as we move. And for now, I'll jump right in with the law. So the first thing I want to say before we even get into the law, at every step of the way, women with disabilities and girls with disabilities and their advocates need to ask for what they need. Be confident that it is your right and that the service provider that you are interacting with may be well-intentioned, and even if they're well-intentioned, they may not know the law as well as you, and they certainly will not know what you need in terms of support in order to succeed. So unfortunately, we're still at a space in terms of the type of training that is happening at the level of police, medical professionals, in the courts, where a lot of the burden of being an advocate is going to come back to the person who actually needs the support in that moment. And so I just want to really foreground that if you need something in terms of navigating these processes, ask for it, it's your right. So now with that, basically the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013 included provisions that safeguarded the rights of women and girls, not only those with disabilities, but also those with disabilities, in order to make sure that they were better able to file complaints with the police, participate in investigations, and navigate the judicial process, right? So it contains provisions that relate to the police, the investigation stage, as well as the courts, and compensation. And the other thing to remember here is that the definition of disability is wide, and it includes the protection also applies to women who may have been seriously physically hurt or who have a temporary disability, as well as across a wide spectrum of disabilities. And this is actually a step forward in Indian jurisprudence. So one thing I would encourage you to do and think about as we move through these steps together is to think about what emergency plan you might create for yourself. And I will keep coming back to points for the emergency plan as we go through, but maybe these are some things to jot down in terms of notes that if you have the answer, you can keep it for yourself now. If you don't have the answer, it might be something to put in place for yourself. So with that, let's start with the police. So the first thing is, in just 3 easy steps, and we will come back to it. When you go to the police, you want to make sure that the police record your statement, okay? And then you want to check that record, and you want to take a copy of that record with you. And you want to leave with a referral for a lawyer. Those 3 things: record your statement, check the record, and leave with a referral for a lawyer. These are very important steps at the police station that need to happen, and now we'll talk about them all in detail, as well as what your rights are at each step. So in terms of recording the statement, what you have access to under the amendments is that the statement or the FIR can be recorded either at the thana or at the home of the woman who has experienced sexual violence or rape, or at another place of your choice. So in thinking through what place is going to be most suitable, the thana often may have long waits. It may be people are sometimes have made to wait overnight. It may take time, especially if someone is not in good condition, as one might be following an experience of violence, you may consider another location. One possibility is your home. Opportunity is to think about maybe recording the statement at an organization nearby, whether it's an organization that is specifically addressing the rights of disabled people, or an organization that works on gender-based violence more broadly, or if you have a one-stop crisis center near to you. Any of those are places where you can go, phone the Thana, and have someone come to you to take your statement. So this is something important to remember. In an incidence of violence, if going to the Thana feels impossible, scary, difficult, and it may be all of those things, you don't have to go. Okay? A police officer is required by law to come to you to take a statement at a place that you have chosen. Now, in addition to that, you want to make sure that your statement is preserved accurately according to the way that you have said it. And so you also have the right to request that that statement be videotaped. So if you decide to call the Thana court and request to have your statement recorded in an alternate location, you should ask at that time as well for the provisions to be made for the statement to be videotaped. Now, the videotaped statement can be very helpful down the line in the court proceedings as well. So that's the first thing in recording your statement. Now, the next thing we're going to discuss is how you record your statement. And the other thing that is a major advance under the 2013 amendments is that by law, you must be given the accommodation or the support that you require in order to record that statement in a way that allows you to give the most information that you can. So that might mean access to sign language interpretation. It may mean someone to help you or support with communication. So that could be a special educator who's able to really break down the process of what type of information you need to give, in what format. It could also be someone you know and trust, a family member, a friend, a counselor, who you feel can help you to give the story in a way that it will make sense and help to guide you in that. And you also have the option to file the report in Braille, if that is your preference. All right. And so the thing to remember about this is that the report that you file is very important, and it shouldn't be rushed, because the material that comes in that first report actually determines what happens for the whole rest of the process. So I'll give you one example. There have been cases in which, and this is actually at the case I'm thinking about was at the Latika Roy Foundation, where a young girl who had an intellectual disability actually needed support over multiple sessions to first get comfortable with the special educator, then to be able to communicate experience to the special educator, and then that special educator to go with her or be present when she actually gave the statement to the police. And the law makes space for that. Now, the law has not done as well as it should in terms of implementation and impaneling those sort of special educators, but that is why I would encourage you, as some of your pre-planning, to think about, if you're in a situation, what type of support might you need to give your statement, who might you call, and to have that information ready and on hand. So those are key points on recording the statement. Just for a recap, you can record the statement Hi. Hi. You can record the statement in any place that is comfortable for you. Yeah, you can record the statement in any place that is comfortable for you. And you can request the accommodations that you need.
Rights and record support that the
And you need to make sure that you then check the record afterward. Now, what are you checking for? You need to make sure that it includes the details of your disability when you make the statement. Do not assume, even if you have a visible physical disability, even if you've spoken to the police officer and explained your disability, you must check that it has been written down, and it has been written down accurately in that first statement, in that first information report. Because if it's not written down, it will actually exclude you from getting other protections moving through the legal system. Okay, so with the police, the most important thing, record the statement, check the record, take the copy with you, and lastly, leave with a referral for a lawyer. So by law, you are entitled to free legal representation. And that legal representation can start from the time you are in the thana. And so you need to get a lawyer assigned to you, because it is much more difficult to get it retroactively. And if you don't have a lawyer assigned, you may be in the position where you are paying for a lawyer in a proceeding that goes for a long time. And that's really a much more challenging place to be. So these are the things. Okay. Now, you can say, Shikha, that sounds very straightforward, makes sense, but what challenges may I face? So some of the challenges that we documented, Nidhi and I, when we traveled around India, really trying to understand what happened in cases where women or girls with disabilities brought forward cases of sexual violence. And one of the main things that we found at the police level is that the police may not have the training or the expert support to handle these cases. So they may even know that you are entitled to have some sort of report to document your statement, but they are very unlikely to have a good idea of what support you need. So one example is that in a case in Delhi, there was a very well-meaning police officer who recognized that the woman who came in needed to have support and accommodation. But that police officer actually just thought that the person who wasn't speaking because they needed a sign language interpreter, not because actually this was a case of trauma and the person had an intellectual disability. And so not being able to match the need of the person with the type of support person can be a major barrier. And so that is where it's very important to know or have someone with you who can explain exactly what you need in order to give that sort of support. So I'm going to move now to the next section, which is on medical care. So there's one main thing to remember in terms of medical care. If you experience sexual violence, or if you are trying to support someone in that situation, get immediate medical attention. And that's for two reasons. One, you need to identify your immediate medical needs so you can get the treatment that you need as soon as possible. But the second one is that physical evidence is very, very important in establishing your case. And the sooner you go to a medical center, to a hospital, to a doctor, and the sooner you are examined, the more likely that signs of the crime that you experienced will still be on your body. So for instance, say in an instance of sexual violence, you feel, I really want to bathe, I'm feeling really exhausted, this has been horrible, I need to sleep. All of those things are actually the most natural for one to feel. You've gone through something horrible. The first thing you want to do is clean yourself, rest, sleep, not even deal with thinking about police, medical. But the first thing you have to do, even before you go to the police, just get yourself to a medical center where they can first see if you have anything dangerous going on for your own health, and second, collect any evidence that might be on your body. Because with each hour, with each day that passes, that evidence is harder and harder to collect, and it makes the case harder and harder to establish. Okay, so next we'll get to the court. So remember when we were talking about the police station and I mentioned to you, you don't have to go to the police station. You can call them and ask them to come to you, but ask them to also bring the video camera because you want to have your statement recorded. So in court, one of the things that is given under the 2013 amendments is that if the initial statement has been recorded, then you don't have to repeat the statement again during trial. You may still have to answer questions from either the judge or the defense lawyer, but you won't have to give the statement again. Now, why is this important? Sometimes it can take years before you actually end up in trial. And if your statement has been pre-recorded, then you don't have to remember in the same way. And you also don't have to go through the experience of recounting and re-experiencing in a very public way where the perpetrator of violence may also be in the courtroom. Maybe other people are in the courtroom who you don't want to speak about something that is so painful. So having the videotape beforehand, and the reason to have it is because by law, that videotape can be used instead of having to testify. So if you've gone through and managed to get the support of a special educator, a counselor, a very close friend, someone from the family, sign language interpreter, someone you trust, where you have as long as you need to give out the statement. You can do it at your home. You can do it at a friend's home. You can do it at an office of an organization you trust. It can be given in a place that's comfortable to you, and you have the opportunity to take the time to give the statement and have it video recorded. That will be a much stronger statement than if you're under pressure quite a long time later in a courtroom. So just remember that you have that right to use your videotaped statement. And so that's why you have to make sure that you take that video recorded statement. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about is compensation. And the first thing on compensation is make sure that your lawyer requests compensation. You are entitled to law to compensation. And say the case actually has no trial because the police are not able to find the perpetrator of violence. Maybe they're not able to be properly identified. You can still get interim relief from the court, even if the case can't go to trial. So it is very important in order to get the treatment that you need. You may need physical treatment, you might need mental health treatment or counseling to deal with the trauma. You may need rehabilitation. You are entitled to get funds to support your recovery under the law. And once it's awarded by the court, you will still need to follow up to make sure that it's actually given. But it's something that if it's not asked for to begin with, then you won't be able to get it. Okay. So with that, I want to go back up and do a quick recap of just thinking through what are key points to know coming out of this session. So the first step, at every stage, police, medical, court, compensation, ask for what you need. It is your right to get the support that you need to express yourself and get the access to justice that is your right under law. You are not asking for any favors, you are asking for your rights. Okay? Now, what you may want to do, even after this training, is create an emergency plan for yourself. Think through, if I ever needed it, if someone from my family ever needed it, what is the number of the thana that I would call? Who is the person that you trust, who you would call, who would help you in this situation and keep your confidentiality and help you navigate these steps? Is there an organization in your area, either a disabled person's organization or a woman's organization that you know of? Can you keep down their number? Is there a one-stop crisis center? The one-stop crisis center scheme has not been evenly implemented, but where there are one-stop crisis centers, what you are often able to get at the same place is the medical examination, as well as recording the statement and being able to work with counselors who are sensitized to these issues of violence, because that is their job, right? So if you're working with any police officer, you could get anyone. You could get someone who's a complete fresher, who doesn't know anything about anything to do with this law. Or you could get a senior woman police officer who's putting a lot of time and energy into making this process better. You don't know. But if you go to a one-stop crisis center, you're more likely to get someone who knows and understands the issues and can support people who are in your position. And then the next question is, the next question is, what doctor would you call? And to keep that number on hand as well. These are just things that if you have them in your phone or in your diary, it just may be helpful for you to feel if something happens, that at least you have a plan and can go forward. So again, at the police station, we're going to remember 3 things. Record your statement. Get the support you need to record your statement. That can be any sort of access to interpretation, sign language interpretation, a special educator, file reports in Braille, something I've not mentioned that would help you. But make sure that you have the support to record the statement. Request that the statement be videotaped. Remember, if you have the statement videotaped, then you don't have to do it again in court. And then, so you're recording the statement, video recording the statement, step 1. Step 2, you're checking that statement. Does it record your age? Does it include the details of your disability. These will be very important things in terms of what your rights are under the law. And the third thing is what you're leaving with. You leave with a copy of the FIR, and you leave with a referral for a lawyer. Okay, so the next step then is in terms of medical care. And there's just one thing that you have to remember: get immediate medical attention. As quickly as you can, as quickly as you manage, get to the doctor, get to the hospital, and have yourself checked physically to make sure that you can get treatment, and also make sure that any evidence from the experience is preserved. At the court, again, you have this videotape. Request that you're able to use the videotape of your statement instead of having to repeat the statement again during trial. Again, this is your right under law. And then for compensation, make sure that the lawyer that you're working with requests compensation. Too many petitions go forward without a request for compensation at all. And even if no trial takes place, remember that you can still get interim relief, a form of financial compensation, even if the offender cannot be traced or identified. That is also your right under the law, to have the resources that you need to look after yourself after an experience of violence. We just talked about the law on the books, right? And we all know that the law on the books is sometimes quite different from the law in action. So this next piece will be really thinking about what are some of the challenges and barriers, and what are some of the things you can do to surmount it. So one of the things that was part of the brief for this was to actually go into case examples. And I actually made a decision to avoid specific examples for two reasons. One is that it is very possible that people in this workshop are themselves survivors of violence. And so discussing cases of extreme violence may actually end up creating a distracting and triggering environment for people. And so I thought, rather than discuss specific cases, I'll just let you know that if you're interested in understanding how these issues played out in particular cases, the Invisible Victim of Sexual Violence report, where I shared the link, the full report in English, has 17 case studies that cross disabilities, cross different states in India. And so if you want to either understand based on someone who maybe is from the same location as you, has some of the same disabilities that you do, or what are some of the innovative strategies that people used as well, I would point you to that resource. But instead, what I did was I went back through that resource and I pulled out what are some of the risk factors for violence for women and girls with disabilities, and what are some of the barriers to accessing justice. So in terms of risk factors for violence, women and girls with physical disabilities may find it more difficult to escape in a violent situation. Those who are deaf or hard of hearing may not be able to call for help. They may not be able to easily communicate the abuse, or they may be more vulnerable to being attacked if they're not able to hear someone coming behind them And these are all situations that are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to change, but at the same time are important for us to keep in mind, and to keep in mind just so that we understand these risks and understand for the people in our lives and around us what they are, to see what steps can be taken to mitigate those risks. It may also be that across disabilities, people have difficulty accessing information and knowing that non-consensual sex acts are a crime. Thanks, Mama. My mom just put my son to sleep so we could go through this undisturbed. And the other thing is that due to dependency on caretakers who may be abusers, it may actually be that women and girls with disabilities are in a very difficult position to come forward. And I would be interested in hearing from participants at the end of the session if there are other risk factors for violence that we should be discussing, or any strategies for mitigating those things. For me, a strategy that I think is powerful is to try to address these risks by extending information. So attending trainings like this, understanding your rights, sharing with other people what their rights are, so that it begins to put people in a position where they have the information they need to at least make decisions in some of these very difficult and risky situations. And then in terms of barriers to accessing justice, one of the biggest barriers that we documented is the stigma that is associated with both sexuality and disability, right? So what you actually end up in cases of sexual violence against women and girls with disabilities is you have two different types of stigma coming together. So I want to discuss them one by one. So stigma associated with sexuality in India and in many, many parts of the world. The shame sometimes that attends, or that people are made to feel for having been a victim of sexual violence, a feeling that it may bring dishonor to their family if it gets out. This sort of thing exists across the spectrum of women's experiences, that that sexual violence itself can be seen as a sort of stigma. But then there can also be stigma around disability. So stereotypes about how credible a woman might be if she has a disability, stereotypes that women with disabilities are either asexual, and so this couldn't have happened to them, or they're hypersexual, and therefore, of course, it would happen to them. Unfortunately, these are some of the preconceived notions and concepts and stigma that surrounds the whole process of seeking justice. So how do those things come together, and how might they impact this process? Someone may not get the support they need when they go to report the abuse to the police. The police may not believe them. The police officer may not even believe that they have a disability. Some of us have disabilities that are not visible, right? And so, beginning at the level of the police, it is very important that if the stigma around sexual violence, and that manifests as, why were you going home late in a rickshaw? Why were you wearing that thing? Why did you spend time with a male tutor? Any of those things can come in. Those sorts of rationales for not filing your statement is against the law. Okay? So if stigma or someone's preconceived notion is creating a barrier to you getting what you need, they are violating the law. And it is at that moment that you can ask to speak to a supervisor, a senior person, and you do not have to put up with that type of situation. Unfortunately, practically, it may take some time to push through, but an answer that we're not going to file either because of your credibility, because of your disability, or because of their opinion of the violence that you experienced, that is against the law. And that stigma can be a barrier, but it is a barrier that the law should be able to help you push through. Now, another barrier to accessing justice may actually be even more difficult if it comes in the form of pressure from family, community, or threats from the person who committed the violence. And those are much more difficult avenues to work through and think through. And that's why part of what I encouraged you to do in the last section was really think about, in an emergency plan, who is a person that you could trust, who you could go to, who would help you to navigate some of these very complicated questions. And the answer is not going to be the same for everyone, but you would do yourself, I think, a good service to be working with someone who will take that pressure off and help you to think through what you want and need, and then how to navigate some of those challenges. So with that, I would like to open up for Q&A and discussion, and also input. There are many people in the audience who have a lot of experience in this area. And if you have things to add, things that you think you could correct, anything like that, I would love to hear your feedback.
I have a couple of questions before we open the floor, Shikha. Definitely, we will open the floor for, and we have sufficient time to open the floor for questions. Before we begin, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about just in terms of access in spaces where you don't have access to all the support systems that are required. Are there any ad hoc measures that can be used? Say, not having access to an interpreter or a special educator, then what are the ways in which people have responded?
So part of the answer is that in the cases that actually make it to court, it's because the DPOs step in, it's because the women's rights organizations step in, and it is a routine experience to call a thana or go to a thana and have them under-equipped in terms of not having the knowledge or experience to give the support that is legally mandated. And in some ways, we want to push the state to build those systems and to impanel those special educators who are capable of working across disabilities. At the same time, we have a broader issue socially that, let alone the special educators that can be impaneled, there is a dearth of understanding outside of DPOs, even in some women's organizations, about how to act on these things. And so what can be done? I think that's why it's very important to do a personal contextual analysis of, okay, based on where I am now, is there a DPO, a disabled persons organization that I could reach out to just so I have their number on hand. They know that I'm here. So if I need that support, I can phone someone to go with me when I need to go and file, who can help me to do that communication. But maybe that won't work for you. And maybe you have a teacher, or maybe you have someone who is a friend of the family who you find you are able to communicate with. And on those very difficult days when it's hard to express what you mean, that they can help you bring forward what you need to say and feel strong in those situations. And that person might not be trained, they may just be a very close friend, you know. And so I think what we can do is make an assessment, a personal assessment of our situation, understand what's missing, and take steps in advance. So for instance, in a worst case scenario, I would imagine if someone doesn't have access to and sees this video, but doesn't have access to an organization locally, either a women's rights organization or a DPO, then, but they do have a trusted teacher who maybe has no understanding of disability, then maybe it would be possible to have a conversation between that teacher and someone from the Rising Flame team to understand remotely, okay, in this situation, what would you do? You know, it's kind of a question of how can we stretch our resources and stretch our information to support each other as much as possible, while at the same time pushing the state to impanel the appropriate services.
I think with regards to sexual violence, it also becomes additionally complicated, like you had said, because of our stigmatized understanding of disabled women in particular, but also that I think a lot of the people who support the who will have to support the woman with disabilities might not have understanding around sexual violence at all, right? So and this has been our experience often, that special educators or even interpreters might not understand the situation, or sometimes it is difficult to communicate that situation in itself, right? So I think that some of the infrastructure, both like physical infrastructure, medical infrastructure, but also the human infrastructure around the woman with disability has to be strengthened, like you're saying, right? The only other question that I really had, I'll ask it in the end, but if anybody else has questions, maybe we can open it up to others.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I had two questions actually. So the first thing is that so for example, if we have seminars like this where we are educated about how the normal approaches towards any kind of violence against women should be like. But there is a huge gap in terms of the education, like especially in schools and colleges. Like I'm myself a master's student, and there is no sense of discussion, there is no sense of curricula which actually covers these kind of aspects around law and legal remedies for women and disabled people. Like for example, when I was in my 11th and 12th, we had human rights and gender studies, but then our school had to remove that subject because first thing, there was some rumors going on that CBSE does not approve. Then the second thing was the schools do not have enough teachers to even bring us externals during our examinations. So the lack of resources, and teachers are not equipped enough to understand the legal nuances of it, and neither the schools or CBSE or any kind of educational committees are interested in doing that. So that is one question. So there's a huge gap as to how to so even if a woman wants to approach the legal remedy, it is beyond her imagination because she does not know how to approach it, even if it's a mere FIR that you have to go and file it into the police. And the second thing was that it happened, it was like personal experience where I was in a kind of an emergency situation at home. And when I called the police, it was at night, and I called the police. So I just Googled and I just called the police station. And that police station, so there are two police stations in my area, like not my area, like one is like nearby to the area and one is literally in my area. So I somehow called the police station, which was which is located in the nearby area, right? So he was like, ma'am, we won't be able to come, but rather you need to call the police station of your particular area, which is like literally what, like difference of 2 kilometers or something. And that police literally was like, you have to call that station or else we can't do anything about it. And second thing and third thing was the police actually, if there is any kind of women's situation, even if it's just like a passport verification, the police actually calls the women to come to the station after 6 o'clock, wherein there is a law or that the police can't call any women to come to the station after 6 o'clock in the evening. So my whole point is that it's also, I don't know about the lack of training and all, but also the police people are really insensitive. Like they don't care of the fact that if you're a woman or not. And if you're in an emergency situation, what kind of proactive action can they take? Because at that situation, the woman is literally goes blind, because for her, the saving of her life becomes such a precarious thing. And on top of that, you are said, oh, call that police station, come to the police station, this and that. So these are the two aspects that I wanted to discuss.
So maybe we can get a couple of other questions on the table, because these are, I think your name is Pari, is that right?
Yeah, Pari, right.
So these are huge questions that you're putting on the table. They're questions that are on one level about access to education, and on the other level about how you really work within inadequate structures, and how do you actually move forward and advocate for your rights within those structures. And these are very important questions, but I'd like to add a few others so we can discuss them together with others, because otherwise we could spend the rest of this session just answering those two questions. I think you really got to the heart of some of the real difficulties in going from law in the books to law in action.
Ambarika here, if I may just tag on to Pari's question.
Sure, Ambalika.
Yeah, what Pari was saying about the nearby police station not recording her statement and asking her to call the station in her locality. There's also this concept of zero FIR, which I'm sure at least police must be trained on that concept. So I really wanted to know what kind of measures are taken against the erring officers who, deny this kind of a thing when they're approached by somebody not belonging to their jurisdiction. What kind of steps are actually being taken? We may go with the excuse that the law is not being implemented well and they may not know about the women's right and so on and so forth, and which is true to a large extent. But what about this concept of zero FIR per se? And why are police not being, made to, I don't know how to put it, basically, why are people not complaining against the police who are not accepting the zero FIRs, and what are the consequences that police as officers have to go through, and are they actually going through, are there processes in place to bring these erring officers to book in this kind of a situation? That is all. Thank you.
So, okay, I'll just bring these couple of questions together and start to give you my preliminary thoughts on them. The first thing on access to education and access to these materials in these sort of curriculums, really the answer is exactly what you're doing right now. Finding the alternate forums that are asking and creating the questions that you want to discuss and learn about, and bringing that information back. It's very, very difficult to shift curriculum with shifting budgets, closing budgets. But as much as Zoom has also been quite a headache with all of these COVID lockdowns, not getting to see one another face to face. It also gives tremendous opportunity for communication and to enter new forums and discussions. And so I would say on one level, you can advocate for the curriculum that you need in the spaces that you are. But if you're in a master's program that's just maximum 5 years, you may not see those changes in your time. Still a good thing to do for the classes that will follow. But in the meanwhile, pursue the information that you want, do the reading that you want. Specifically, I would actually recommend joining um, um, academia.edu because it's an area where a lot of people publish open source publications. And so even if you don't have access to libraries digitally, then you may be able to access information there. I, for instance, put up everything that I write open source, open information to be downloaded and used. In terms of how you work within the structural limitations of institutions such as the police, where there are clear laws that say based on that you can file a zero FIR anyway, and they refuse to fire. What you have to do is you have to know about the zero FIR, and then you have to ask for the senior person in charge. And you have to keep on taking the issue up higher, right? So you may have initially an officer that you speak to, and they say, I won't file. And then you say, I need to speak to your supervisor. And then you speak to that supervisor. And if you end up coming to a place where the most senior person in that thana is still refusing that zero FIR, then that needs to be taken up to a further political level, towards the level of the sort of more superintendent of police. Because the only way that those things change and that those rights actually come into practice, and that is if we push to make those structural changes. Now, I say that at the same time as in a moment where you are particularly exhausted, come to a thana, you should be able to file anywhere and you're sent to run around. The last thing you may feel like doing is fighting up the hierarchy to get the complaint lodged. But what you can at least do is you can take the name and you can take the ID number of the particular police officer who refused to file that zero FIR, and you can write a formal complaint. So at least maybe the person after you won't experience the same thing. I mean, it's hard to change things structurally and to get new laws actually activated, and the way that they get activated is step by step with each of the people who fight to have them activated.
Can I ask? Hello.
Hello, I can't hear you, Kaushal.
Yeah. Yeah. So may I speak in Hindi?
Look, I'm not sure if everybody in the room understands Hindi.
So, first of all, I would like to thank to Shikha for this session. This is a really important session. And also from my point of view, this is the same what I was looking for my research. First thing which I want to add when I have planned this research, first thing which I have read your work, was you were talking about Human Rights Watch report. So first report I have watched, and then I have write a research paper about for a conference, which is CWDS national conference. So then I have planned to research on this. So my area of research is disability and sexual violence. So in my research, I'm looking if women with hearing and speech disability facing sexual violence, then how they are getting justice and what kinds of hurdles what kinds of problem they are facing. So uh, right now I'm just finishing my work. I'm just submitting my research. So uh, one thing which you have mentioned, that if you have already documents your voice, which you have to complain against someone, and you don't have need to register it again, because you don't have need to experience the same. But I have when I was doing my field work, and there were so many uh, parents of women with the young and speech disability who were survivors. So the family members of survivors were saying that when we were in trial, when we were in court, the person who was an advocate of opposite side for victim, uh, I sorry, for accused, he was asking this question, like uh, he was asking this question like uh, पहले क्या हुआ था, फिर क्या हुआ था, उसने ये कैसे किया था, उसके बाद क्या किया था. So all these questions were coming around this case. So they were saying that हम लोग ये सोच रहे थे कि ये इस तरह के क्वेश्चन पूछना कब बंद करेगा, क्योंकि इस तरह से क्वेश्चन जो थे वो हम लोगों को बहुत अजीब सा महसूस करा रहे थे. और वो जो क्वेश्चंस थे जो उसने पूछे उनसे, उससे सर्वाइवर के लिए भी एक अलग तरह का माहौल बन रहा था. So I want to ask to you that is there any law which uh, uh, provide protection against all these kinds of environment in judicial process?
So I'm going to give you a less direct answer because I cannot cite you particular provisions right now. But what I would say is that one thing that we've seen even more from India's high courts than from the Supreme Court is really taking up some of these issues about what type of evidence is required, what type of questions can be asked, and actually creating even more answers on how to implement the protection. So why I say I can't give you a specific answer on this right now is that the number of cases we have under the 2013 amendments is still few, whereas I have done much more research on the implementation of Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, where looking at, because it's been more than 10 years in play. So then you start to see cases come up to the high court level. And what you start to see is times where the judiciary will come in and they will say, no, that information about that woman's life should not be included in this discussion, for instance. That it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant to the decision of whether or not she experienced domestic violence. And then a lawyer can go in those moments and say, according to this high court decision, this type of comment has been like should not come up in this sort of case, etc. There are also certain things around rules of evidence that could be looked into, and maybe Srinidhi, this is actually something that we might think about taking up and thinking about. And so I had worked with SWAYAM on this manual on PWDBA, and what their experience was is that the SWAYAM social workers often knew more than the lawyers about the contours of the act. So they needed to have a checklist of what should and should not be allowed to be said in court, brief the lawyers, and give them the legal citations. And so I wonder if it may be useful to have some sort of debriefing like this in a Rising Flame forum, pull together more of these stories like Kaushal has brought, and then see what are the precedents that we could bring to play that could then be used in those situations. So I think this is a really good question and a hard question, and also an important one to really think about how to cut short the types of intimidation. And really what you're describing is intimidation of the survivor.
Yeah, and I think also that the not taking into account what you're saying is about reliving the trauma, right? And having to keep reliving it till the court sessions are done. Right? So, yeah. Does anybody else have a
Yeah,
question?
yeah. So this is again me. So you were talking about the stigma, which stigma related to disability, stigma related to disability. But what about the question of mobility, which if someone if someone face sexual violence and due to the disability of the women with disability, she was not able to express, she was not able to uh, recognize to family who were the perpetrator, because she was a student and she was going to her school, and in the middle of the way she get raped. So the फैमिली ने उसको ये बोलने के बजाय कि मतलब तुम्हारे साथ डिसेबिलिटी है और तुम उस डिसेबिलिटी की वजह से हमको ये नहीं बता पाई हो, फैमिली ने उल्टा उसके पीछे ये किया कि उसके पीछे जब वो कहीं दुकान जा रही है, बाजार जा रही है या कहीं भी जा रही है, उसके पीछे कोई ना कोई परिवार का व्यक्ति जो है भेज दिया गया कि आप उल्टा इसी पे शक करिए। सो और उसकी जो मोबिलिटी है, उस मोबिलिटी पे हर एक चीज को लेकर लगातार क्वेश्चन किया जाने लगा। सो एंड व्हेन जब मैं उनसे उनके फैमिली मेंबर्स के साथ इंटरव्यू करने के लिए गया अपने रिसर्च के लिए, तो परिवार के जो मेंबर्स थे, उसके फादर थे सर्वाइवर के, उन्होंने उनसे मैंने कहा कि आप अगर सोचिए, अगर आप इस अगर एक्यूज को आप पहचान पाते, वो आपकी मदद करा देती, अगर वो जिस तरह से वो बताना चाहती उस तरह से आप समझ लेते, तो क्या आप उस केस को दर्ज करना चाहते? तो वो उनका जवाब था कि हम कोई नीची जात थोड़े हैं, हम कोई नीची जात के व्यक्ति थोड़े हैं, यानी कि नीची जात के व्यक्ति के साथ इस तरह का इस घटना जो है घट सकती है। और मैंने कहा कि मैंने कहा तो आप दर्ज नहीं कराते हो ना? नहीं, हम क्या हम सब अगर हम ये दर्ज कराते, ये बात बाहर निकल के जाती, तो इससे समाज में या जहाँ हम रह रहे हैं वहाँ पे हमारे रिलेटिव्स हैं, उनके बीच में हमारे लिए क्या इन्वायरमेंट बनता। सो अगेन आई थिंक मुझे नहीं पता कि स्टिग्मा के दायरे में आएगा, लेकिन when we are talking about the disability, when we are talking about the sexual violence, and we are talking about the access to justice, then we should also think about the environment which was creating around her.
I mean, I think that
So there's a lot of layers there.
Sorry, Shikha, you could continue.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I think that in practice, this is what all three days, all three facilitators were saying the same thing. All violence against disabled women and children is surrounded by stigma, right? Because there is stigma around people with disabilities, and I think that is part of the reason why access to justice is so hard for women with disabilities. And I think even if we look at the Human Rights Watch report that categorizes the acts of violence, you see in the case studies how much how much stigma needs to be fought along the way. And I think that can only happen. I mean, we can only get rid of the stigma as we continue to do conversations and speak to all the people that are in the orbit of the woman. Yeah, sorry, Shikha.
Yeah, the other thing I was just going to say is that, again, the types of things that you describe in terms of stigma, curtailing, mobility, these types of things, it's not only for women with disabilities, it's also in general for women who, for instance, work in a factory setting and they experience some sexual harassment or sexual violence, then they may also be reluctant to bring it home because then they may be required to quit their job and stay at home. And there's just this idea that mobility is still something that so many women have to fight for in India, and freedom of mobility, and that anything that they have experienced as violence, it's their fault because they were mobile, right? They shouldn't have been there. They should not be allowed to travel alone. And so we have these very sort of layers of patriarchy that have to be unraveled, and at the same time that's a very, very long it's a very, very long trajectory, and it's something that we just have to work on in big and small ways wherever we can. I just wanted to mention that I had some requests on the chat for my Facebook link, but I actually don't use Facebook, so I can instead share my Twitter handle if that's useful. So I'm just sharing that in case it's useful.
I mean, also coming back to what we have heard from facilitators for the past 3 days, right? That all reporting of violence by women has consequences, and it has barriers in the process of reporting, of the access to justice, of making sense of the violence itself, right? And that is part of the struggle that all women's rights organizations, everybody who's working to end discrimination and violence continues to face. Right? And I suppose the answer is a long-term one more than immediate one. One question, Shikha, there was a recent judgment around sexual violence and women with disabilities that reference the Human Rights Watch uh, uh, report. I just wanted to check if something has shifted in what the in the court said in reference to sexual violence when it pertains to women with disabilities.
I think something that was actually really important about that judgment is it was actually the case of rape of a Dalit woman with disabilities. And so what we actually saw was the case adjudicating at the intersection of the Scheduled Castes, Scheduled Tribes Atrocities Act, which is what it was filed under, but then bringing in the learnings from the disability rights movement and looking also at the ways in which the judicial process had unfolded in order to use protections under the 2013 amendments to actually reach a judgment under the SCST Act. So I think that's exactly the sort of jurisprudence that we want to see going forward, where just because something has come under SCST Act doesn't mean that it's not drawing from the strengths of 2013 amendments and all of the work and advocacy that has been done in the disability rights movement. And the judgment actually starts with a discussion of intersectionality and really positioning the fact that in looking at these types of cases, one has to look and really uncover the multiple levels and multiple layers of discrimination as a woman, as a Dalit woman with disabilities, and how it is actually, that is the picture that one needs to adjudicate in thinking through what is just as far as relief, compensation, etc.
Thank you. If nobody else has any questions, then I'd like to close by thanking Shikha. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shikha, for taking the time and for condensing a very expansive uh, uh, stretch of what relief looks like for disabled women under criminal law amendment. What is the process? What are the steps, and how we can go forward and access the rights that are present within the legislation. But also, I think, thank you for reminding us of the many barriers that we do encounter, but also ways for us to work around the barriers and to ensure that our requests and our rights are met under this legislation. It was a pleasure for us to have you here, and we have shared all the Human Rights Watch reports uh, in the chat box, and also the link to the recent judgment, which speaks about violence against Dalit women with disabilities. So thank you again. And on behalf of Rising Flame, I would like to thank Atul and Neha for their interpretation services. Our coordinator, Shweta, for facilitating this process for all of us. And for everybody who attended, thank you so much for joining us.
My Rights, My Safety, a workshop series on people with disabilities and the law by Rising Flame. Below this are Rising Flame's website and social media links. Website risingflame.org, Instagram risingflame_now, Twitter Rising Flame Now, Facebook Rising Flame Now.